The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's great to be back in my hometown, Toronto, and North York in particular, where I lived. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to have a little chat with Scott for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions. Scott, welcome to Toronto.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It's not very often that I get to interview someone whose latest book has been described in the New York Times as masterly, exceptional, and important. So I hope I don't go clumped in front of you. It's also a deeply researched and beautifully written book with just a clear-eyed sense of history. Scott, I'm going to begin by kind of situating this book within your body of work. About 10 years ago, you published Lawrence in Arabia.
Right.
Which sort of deals with the early 20th century history, and then earlier than that, there was the Fractured Lands, which kind of deals with the aftermath of the Arab Spring,
right.
Which is early 21st century, and now you're going a little bit back into the 20th century, and I see all three books as forming a kind of trilogy of what for simplicity's sake, for now, I'm just going to call it the Middle East, but I know it's much more complex than that. So maybe I can you can begin by sort of talking about your interest in the region in particular, and and the kind of how exciting or daunting it is to cover its past and present.
Right. Thank you, Kamal, and yeah, it's very nice to be here. So when I started out as a journalist, I started covering war, and inevitably, if you cover modern war, it means you spend a lot of time in the Middle East. And that was about 30 some odd years ago. And whenever I'd have a kind of a detailed conversation with someone in the region, people would always say to me, to really understand the Middle East of today, you need to go back and see how the region was carved up at the end of World War I by the British and the French imperial powers. And this is really the starting point for so many of the problems of today in the Middle East. So it was always in the back of my mind that at some point I would like to kind of get off the streets for a while and kind of explore that history. So that became Lawrence in Arabia, and I centered it on T.E. Lawrence, but also three other Western spies, essentially, who were operating at the same time: a German, the only American intelligence agent in the Middle East during World War I, and a Jewish settler who ran a spy ring. So that became that, and through that, I feel like I kind of told the story of the kind of the creation of the modern Middle East. Fractured Lands was what I did about 6-7 years ago now. And it was looking at kind of the aftermath of the Arab Springs throughout the region. I and my photographer, he hates it when I call him my photographer, but we spent almost 2 years going around not full time, but at different times, going to Syria and Iraq and just all through the region. And kind of telling the story of what happened in Libya and what happened in these different countries, both the promise of the Arab Spring and then in almost all cases, the collapse of it. But what I also became aware of through my journalism is how much the Iranian Revolution has affected not just, obviously the region, but in fact events around the world. It really was the start. I don't know if it was the creation of, but it was for the first time you had a religious counter-revolution, but also the kind of birth of religious nationalism that you now see in every faith, every major faith around the world. And it's not just Islam, it's Christian nationalism, Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, Hindu nationalism in India. I think there's the roots of a lot of it start with the Iranian Revolution. And then just finally on that, I happen to be one of the, there's a difference of opinion of when exactly the Iranian Revolution started. But one that a lot of people choose is November 15th, 1977, and that's when the Shah came to Washington to meet Jimmy Carter for the first time. And instead of this kind of triumphant visit between these two leaders, Unfortunately for the Shah, it was being carried on live national TV back in Iran. 4,000 anti-Shah demonstrators showed up in the streets of Washington, D.C., and there was a pitched battle. Over 120 people were injured, and I happened to be there. I was working for the Treasury Department directly across the street from the White House, so I was kind of at the ground zero of the whole thing. And
Use the term.
and I got beat up. I don't think I was one of the. They didn't count me as one of the injured because I didn't go to the hospital or anything. But yeah, I got knocked to the ground and by a stick. But that's and prior to that, I had traveled through Iran with my father as a kid, as well as a 15-year-old, and had been fascinated by the whole region. I had never been in the Middle East before, and my father took me out of school and we drove from France to India and back for a year. So, and through Iran, through Afghanistan. So, anyway, long answer to.
You have lived experience of the region as well. Something I love about your work is that seamless mix of reporting, and you are like a dogged, intrepid reporter in the classic sense. You've been in wars, you covered wars, but also that you're writing as a historian. And I kind of wanted to ask, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that tension between writing the first draft of history, which we normally call journalism, and that sort of long view of as a historian, and what sort of connects the two, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I feel like both with my journalism and my books, I've always thought of myself more as a storyteller than either a historian or a journalist in a way. And probably, I think maybe it's because I grew up overseas. My father was with USAID, which the now deceased USAID. So I grew up in East Asia. And I think that it was so I've always felt I had a bit of an objective view of my own country, having been raised abroad. But also the kind of need to, so I've never been a hard news reporter. I've never done daily news. I've always done long form, 10,000 word stories where I'll go to a place and spend a month on the ground. And I'm always trying to find a story, to try to get an average American reader to read 8,000, 10,000 words on, say, Darfur. You got to tell a story. You first have to entertain before you can inform. And I think I kind of do the same thing when I'm writing books. It's always about people. And what amazes me again and again about history, and I think this is where maybe I have a departure from like a classic historian. I feel like when you're writing classic history, you have this thesis of this happened because of this that happened before. And I feel an awful lot of stuff, and I think the Iranian Revolution is just a classic example of it, is that a lot of stuff just happens by accident. It's just weird coincidences. The wrong thing happens at the right time, or vice versa. So there's kind of a capriciousness about it and that's part of what I find fascinating about it. I started out writing novels, and what I've found increasingly, and I definitely found it with this subject, is that just things happen that you could never put in a novel. People think, no, this is just too stupid. It's like.
Actually, kind of brings me to a question I had for you. I mean, in this book, you put forward two propositions here. One, that the Iranian Revolution is the most improbable of all events. Like, no one knows how it all happened. It just came together. And you write about that. You interview other people, and people say, I don't know how it all happened. And at the same time, you say it is probably the most important revolution, and you put it next to the French and the American Revolution. So, Scott, riddle me this. How can the two scenarios be accurate at the same time? I mean, I know they are, but in your mind, how can you reconcile something that was so improbable at the same time had such a lasting impact?
Yeah, but I think that's kind of in the nature of history. I think if you really went back and, say, studied the American Revolution, there were moments in the American Revolution, I'm thinking of one in particular, where in New York, the colonial army had been thrashed by the British. They were trapped in this one little neighborhood of what is now Brooklyn. They were going to be wiped out. George Washington was trapped. And then a fog came in, and they were able to get across the river to Manhattan. And if that hadn't happened, if the British had attacked that night, I mean, maybe the whole revolution would have been squelched right there. So I think there's always these weird moments in history. But I do think that I'd say the two most profound historical moments in my life have been the Iranian Revolution and the collapse of communism, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But I think in a lot of ways, if you look around the world, what has really animated so much forces for good and bad is really the Iranian Revolution.
And we'll talk a little bit later about its long-lasting impact. All right, okay, we beat around the bush long enough. Let's talk about the Shah of Iran.
Yeah.
Let's go into our title character. And it's really impossible to separate him from the Iranian Revolution, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try to kind of carve a little space for the man and the king first. I mean, reading the book, it's hard not to kind of come away thinking, wow, this guy is a mix of Richard II and Hamlet. Like, he's ditherer, he's insecure, he's capricious, but he's also very powerful. And I think at some point, when he was young, you describe him as he's been described as a tense, taut little boy who's kind of retained some of that characteristics. But the thing that I find amazing about the way he comes across in your book, particularly, and I have to admit I haven't read the biography of him before, and not that this is a biography, but he's the title character. He's someone to whom history just happens. He's not an agent of history. No. And I just would love you to kind of tell us more about him and also his relationship with Farah Pahlavi, the Shabanu, who you interviewed in Washington, and maybe bring us some tidings from that interview as well.
Right. I find the Shah certainly the most contradictory figure that I've written about, and maybe that I've even ever read about. Brilliant, horribly insecure, could never get enough affirmation, was always kind of begging the Americans for more affirmation, jealous, imperious, but also soft-hearted. And I really think that part of what did in the Shah was that he always looked for other people to do the dirty work. He was a soft man masquerading as a hard man, and one of his biographers, said he was a hare, a rabbit, masquerading as a lion, and I think that's really true. He was a weak man, and very much in the shadow of his father, who had been the Shah before him, who had created the Pahlavi dynasty. His father was a semi-literate cavalry officer, 6'4", brutal, but also kind of wrenched 1920s, 1930s Iran into the modern era, very much like Ataturk in Turkey. I think the Shah always kind of lived in his father's shadow, and in every critical moment, when in 1953, when Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, was really usurping the Shah's authority, and the CIA came up with a plan to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah to his powers, and they planned a coup, and they went to the Shah and said, "This is what we're planning," and for months the Shah went back and forth whether to do it or not, and then and finally, 2 days before the coup is scheduled to happen, he backs out. And the American CIA, the CIA official in charge of the operation, sneaks into the palace. He hides under a blanket in the footwell of a car, gets into the palace, confronts the Shah, and says, "Look, you can't back out now. The coup is going forward with you or without you." And the coup went forward. But when the coup went forward, the Shah had gone, and his wife at the time had gone to a palace on the Caspian Sea, and then had flown on, because the coup was kind of uncertain that it was going to work for a day or two. He flew on to Iraq, and then he was a pilot, and so he flew his own plane to Iraq, and then flew on to Rome. So when 3 days later the CIA-led coup actually succeeded, the Shah was having lunch at the Excelsior Hotel in Rome. And rather hangdog had to come back and return to the throne. In 1964, when he exiled Khomeini, it was his prime minister who actually ordered Khomeini's arrest and then his exile, and sent the soldiers in the streets and killed several hundred of Khomeini's supporters. That time, the Shah kind of took credit for it because it made him look like a strong man. But time and again, and then, of course, then you get to the revolution. You get to 1978. He's confronted by this growing rebellion, and he's like a deer in headlights. He doesn't know what to do. I think another key thing about the Iranian Revolution is that along with the kind of the religious fervor of the opposition to the Shah, there's also this element of anti-colonial rebellion about it. The Shah was seen by his own people, a lot of his own people, as the American Shah. And that goes back to 1953, the Americans putting him back on the throne.
Iran as a client state.
It's a client state, and it becomes an increasingly important American ally in the region. Right. So he was never able to kind of get out from under the label of being the American Shah. So when the revolution starts and he starts making concessions, offering elections the following year, it's not seen as progress by the opposition. It's seen as a sign of weakness, that he's just doing what the Americans are telling him to do. So every which way, things didn't work out for him. Farah, who I spent a very long interview with in Washington. She goes back, she's 87 now, and still a beautiful woman. Yeah.
We sound like Jimmy Carter now.
Jimmy
Carter kept referring to her physical
Jimmy Carter was
appearance.
always like saying, "Oh, you should be a movie star. You're so beautiful." And,
right.
Which she really resented. She was college educated. She had gone to the French School of Architecture in Paris, but she had a sense of the street, a sense of she had a charisma that the Shah never had. Mm-hmm. And she had a feel for the people that he didn't. Yeah. And even when the revolution was going on, she would go into the shanty towns of Tehran, and these were supposed to be the hotbeds of the rebels, and women would shower her with flowers. They would hold their babies out for her to kiss. Mm-hmm. She saw problems coming as early as 1975, and at one point said to her husband, I think the people are getting tired of us. Mm-hmm. And of course, he didn't want to hear it.
Why was it hard for him to accept advice from her specific, or feedback from her, if you want to call that? I know not formal advice, but in general, like he would solicit different opinions, but then not act on any of it.
That's right. He would solicit different opinions from people, but to a degree, but he also increasingly surrounded himself with sycophants, and as time, also one of these happenstances of history. The one man, there are two people that the Shah would listen to sometimes, and change his mind under the sway of their words. Farah, his wife, and this man Asadullah Alam, who was his best friend. Alam died in the middle of the revolution, and Alam had actually been the prime minister at the time that they kicked Khomeini out of the country 15 years earlier. He had been the one who had put the soldiers on the street, so he had much more of a sense, Alam, of how to maneuver than the Shah did. So the fact that Alam died in the midst of it, and then there was nobody else, and so you get to this really crazy moment where the Shah becomes convinced that the Americans and the British are conspiring with the Russians or with Khomeini to overthrow him. And the two people he's listening to for advice are the American and British ambassadors. So the two men who are representatives of the countries he thinks are trying to destroy him. Yeah. He turns to for advice.
Yeah,
so it's just kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah. I mean, but also again, there is something very, I want to say sympathetic, and like the weight of events was just so heavy and so much was at stake, and one man had to make a decision.
That's right.
I mean, I can't even decide what to have for breakfast, and he's having to make decisions on behalf of a nation.
Right.
And his but I find, I mean, I'm glad you touched on that, because the paranoia was obviously coming across, like a sense of paranoia.
Right.
Everybody is a potential enemy, and
Right.
suddenly maybe a friend, and it's. I mean, I just imagine that it must be hard to govern under those.
Yeah, and one thing I will say to the Shah's credit is that, again, he was a soft man, and as he said, as the revolution is going on, he said this a number of times to the American ambassador, to the British ambassador: if I have to keep my throne at the cost of destroying the youth of my nation, I won't do it. And in fact, the numbers of people who were killed in the Iranian Revolution were vastly exaggerated by the opposition. The figure that's often quoted by the regime is 60, 70,000. And in fact, shortly after the revolution succeeded, the clerics had a fact-finding commission to count all the dead, and it was about 2,700. So it's and so. Yeah, so so the Shah, when it really came down to the choice of wantonly machine gunning students in the streets, I just don't think he could stomach it.
And it's hard to believe that he actually died at 60, because when you look at pictures in late life, I mean, he looked much older than
Much older.
Much older.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that he was sick and dying of cancer as well. But when I see those pictures, I grew up in the Middle East, so I remember seeing those pictures, and you would have never thought. I thought that was a really old man dying. You mentioned the U.S. and the British ambassador, but I want to sort of go into another relationship, a triangle in a way, not a love triangle, obviously, maybe like a love, like fear and loathing triangle, and the history of three men in particular, both the relationship and the animosity, obviously. And the three men are the Shah of Iran, Jimmy Carter, former American president, and obviously Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini. And it is such a complex dynamic. It's like, in many ways, the history of the world, the future of the world, rested on the opinions of three men who were flawed in such different,
very different
and
ways.
complex ways. So can we talk about that triangle? Because I'm particularly fascinated in the friendship between the Shah and Jimmy Carter, who seemed to have a genuine fondness for the Shah.
They had a genuine fondness at the beginning, but then as time went on, and the other feature of the Shah is he always had to blame somebody else. So as he saw his throne going down the tubes, he was in that way he was like Lear. He was another Shakespearean figure of just howling at the fates and blaming Carter for it. Blaming the Carter administration for not giving a clear sign of what he should do, when after all he's the head of state, he should know himself what to do. It's that triangle you're talking about is a really fascinating one, and I think the one that people really. One of the riddles that I felt I needed to try to figure out was with Khomeini. Was this a man? Was he an accident of history? Was he happened to be at the right place at the right time, or was he actually much more cunning and manipulative than most people give credit for? And I came to the conclusion it was very much the latter. That if you go back and look at Khomeini's early writings, he was an absolutist, and this whole idea that the only legitimate government is one appointed by God, and how that's determined is a little vague, but apparently Khomeini had the answers. And so what happened with Khomeini is you had this small group of people around him, actually three men, who had all Western educated, all kind of moderate Islamists, and they were called the three viziers, the three men around Khomeini. Yazdi being one, and Yazdi unfortunately was dead, but I had long interviews with his son-in-law, and I think these three men all thought they could kind of control Khomeini. They could, well, one thing they could do was moderate what he was saying to the Western press, because nobody in the Western press spoke Farsi. So famously, at one point, when Khomeini and his advisors would go to Paris, he had been in exile in Iraq for 14 years. He goes out to, and he goes, Yazdi convinces him to go to Paris, where, of course, the world media is there. And at one point, Khomeini had given a date for the Shah to leave Iran. And a Western journalist asked Khomeini, again, via Yazdi, because none of the Western journalists spoke Farsi,
And that's so perfect.
said, well, what will you do if he doesn't leave by that date? And Khomeini's literal answer was, I will call for rivers of blood to flow. And the way Yazdi translated it back to the journalist was, he'll be very upset. You know, so so there's things about the Iranian Revolution. It's what I came to again and again. Things that this is only 45 years ago, but in a lot of ways, the level of communications, the level of the way information spread, had more in common with 200 years ago than it does today. So Khomeini's writings had never been translated in English. One way that Khomeini was spreading the word of revolution into Iran was through tape cassettes of his sermons, and they were being mass-produced underground, and they were all over Iran. The CIA and the American embassy finally thinks, well, we should find out what's on these tape cassettes, and so I'm sure they sent out the local nationals to buy the tapes in the bazaar. But they never listened to them because they didn't speak Farsi. And so 2 years later, when the students take over the embassy and they're ransacking the embassy looking for secrets they're finding drawers of these tape cassettes of Khomeini that had never been listened to, never transcribed. And I make the point in the book that anybody with a laptop and a Google search could find out more about Khomeini today than all the intelligence agencies of the West could have in a month, back in 1978.
Well, I agree. There's definitely technological, effective technological advancement. I also think there is malfeasance or incompetence in
Right.
the American government. I want to move to that, but I just want to make sure that we've covered that triangle that we talked about.
Yeah.
Just going back to the Jimmy Carter, one of the most difficult decisions he had to make is to allow the Shah even to come back to the U.S.
That's right.
And at some point he actually says, if we do that, can you guarantee that the American mission in Tehran will not be
right?
Like he literally foresaw the hostage crisis.
That's right.
Basically.
No, it's this bizarre moment. So the revolution succeeds in February of 1979. Mm. What people forget is in the midst of that, the American embassy was attacked by gunmen. Several people were killed, and the American embassy workers were taken prisoner. They were freed 8 hours later or so. Then for the next 9 months, the Shah, who is in exile, he keeps trying to get to the United States. They keep rebuffing him, and the ambassador in Tehran is saying, at one point said, if you let the Shah into the United States, we're going to come out of here in boxes, meaning coffins. So they keep turning the Shah down, and then you get to October of 1979. All of a sudden, the Shah is deathly ill. And at first, of course, the Carter administration didn't believe it because, how convenient, that, and he needs to come to an American hospital. But again, Carter is acutely aware of the danger of letting the Shah in the United States. So at this meeting, and it was a top secret meeting on October 23rd, so about 10 days before the hostage taking, Carter, in the Oval Office, he brought his top foreign policy people in, and as Carter would do this, he would go around the room and ask everyone their opinion. And he asked everybody, should we let the Shah in for medical treatment? And everybody said, yes, you have to, because it's a matter of national honor. He's a former ally and everything. And Carter said, what are you guys going to tell me when they attack our embassy and take our people hostage? And nobody said anything. And Carter said, Yeah, I thought that's what you'd say. And then 10 days later,
Exactly
it
what
happens.
happened. Yeah, that's quite a moment. I mean,
Yeah.
I love these tidbits of history that you share in the book. But I would have to say that one of my favorite things about the book, and now we get now into the question about the sheer incompetence of the entire intelligence service and foreign service and White House when it came to Iran, considering that it was, one of the most important financial and regional relationships in American history. The level of ignorance about Iran history and the language is staggering.
Right.
One character is an outlier to all of this. This is Michael Mitrinko, who kind of emerges as both the hero and anti-hero of this book.
Right.
I love him. I'm so glad he's still alive and he's still around. And maybe one day when I grow up, I want to be him. But for those who haven't read the book, can you just tell us who Michael Mitrinko is and why he matters? Why he's almost as important to me, what reading the book, as the Shah or Farah?
So Michael Mitrinko, he first went to Iran in 1970 as a Peace Corps volunteer, and he was sent up to the mountains into a remote village where he taught English, and then he taught at a teacher's college. Spoke fluent Farsi, and he was also a very gregarious, outgoing guy. So he had developed a huge network of friends.
Well, gregarious, I call it anger management.
Right. yeah. I'll get to that one. So he comes back in 1977, just a few months before the Shah goes to Washington, and so this is in March of 1977. Iran has had this huge gold rush, oil rush, with quadrupling of oil prices, billions of dollars flowing into the economy, but now it's gone into recession, and people are flooding, or there's a line of people that goes on for 2 days of people trying to get visas at the American embassy to get out. And because he speaks Farsi, Mitrinko is put in the visa section, and he just hears one story after the other of wealthy people trying to get out of the country, and finally one guy says to him, "This place is about to explode." Mitrinko reports this to his superiors at the embassy, and he's first reprimanded because the ongoing narrative is the Shah has everything under control. That he's going to stay in power for the next however many years and then pass things on to his son. But he keeps reporting this, and to the point where they see him as a troublemaker. So they ship him off to this provincial city of Tabriz in northwestern Iran as the consular officer, the one American in this city. And as luck would have it, it's in Tabriz where the first huge explosion of the revolution happens in February of 1978. Mitrinko is there, the consulate gets attacked, but what happens is almost all of downtown Tabriz is destroyed by these bands of young men who come out of the shanty towns and destroy anything that's modern, anything that's Western, anything that smacks of the Pahlavi dynasty, of the royalty. And again, Mitrinko writes up a report and says, these kind of disenfranchised young men who are now on the outskirts of every city in Iran. They came in from the countryside during the boom. They're very religious. This is just a powder keg ready to explode. Again, it's ignored. But most famously in this, because the Tabriz riots were so huge. There had been a precursor to this about a month earlier, but it had been small enough scale that the state-controlled media had squelched that story. Tabriz, they couldn't squelch it. Over 200 people, about 200 people were killed. The city center was gutted. So it played on the headlines of every Iranian newspapers, lead story on the television news and radio for days. So about 5 days after the riots were put down, Mitrinko gets a message from a CIA officer in Tehran that he's coming up to see him. And Mitrinko goes, well, thank God, because up until then, the CIA had never done any domestic intelligence gathering inside Iran at all. It was one of the biggest CIA stations in the world. They did no domestic intelligence gathering. So Matrenko thinks finally somebody is taking an interest in what's actually happening in the country. So the guy flies out to Tabriz. Matrenko meets him at the airport. They're driving into the city center, and the scene of devastation. And the CIA officer looks out and goes, "What the hell happened here?" He was coming to see Matrenko on something completely different. He had not heard of. This is almost like on September 16th, not having heard of September 11th. I mean, it's just. But this happened again and again, and nobody in the CIA in Iran spoke Farsi. It's just kind of, yeah.
I mean, we use language that kind of tragic hero or tragically flawed, but this is a comedy of errors in many ways. Like what happened, that those sequence of events, the fact that almost nobody in the American embassy except the locals spoke Farsi.
That's right.
The fact that there was such a sort of jockeying for different interpretations and a kind of Pollyannish attitude that everything will be okay. He's going to be. I think there's at some point he's going to be the Shah for the next 10 years or more.
Right.
But like, how do you aside from the language part, like how? With hindsight and everything that you know now, how do you explain that huge gap in intelligence? Like, how do you make sense of it? It seems to me today that it's inconceivable.
I can actually explain it pretty easily because having grown up overseas, my father wasn't State Department, but by USAID. Wherever the Americans go in big numbers, they create a little mini America, and they live inside that bubble. So in Tehran, it was a huge diplomatic mission, 300 Americans, probably, and again, in almost every American mission, the ratio of local hires is about 2 to 1, two locals to 1 American. In Tehran, it was actually about 3 to 1. And so all those people, of course, support the regime. That's how they got the job, because they were vetted by the Shah's secret police. And so for them, of course, they're loyal to the Shah. Americans, they have a commissary, a PX, American enclaves, American school, American club. So you can live inside a bubble. And I mean, I make the point in the book that you could actually do a tour as an American diplomat, a 2-year tour, where the only Iranians you speak to, outside of the locals inside the embassy who are going to be pro-Shah, is your gardener and housekeeper. And a lot of people did. So Americans, and they do this now too. That hasn't changed. And it's very different from the European model. The European model, diplomats go and serve 4 or 5 years in place. They usually know the language. Americans, the standard tour is 2 years, and then you're bounced somewhere else. So yeah, Americans create this little enclave, and now it's actually even gotten worse now since September 11th, because now there's this bunker mentality in the American diplomatic community, where in one embassy after another. When I was covering the war in Darfur, I went to Khartoum to interview the American ambassador in Khartoum, and the American embassy in Khartoum is literally a bomb-proof metal cage. All the entire 6-7-story building is covered in this kind of thick wire mesh, that's bomb-proof. 5 levels of security to get in. All the American diplomats lived on the compound. The only time they ever left the compound was in an armored convoy to go to a government ministry, and that's their view of Sudan. And it's replicated all. I was in Oslo, and the American embassy in Oslo looks like Hitler's bunker. I mean, it's behind this giant fence. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That actually explains. There's always a good reason for everything. We're going to open it to the floor for questions. I see Sergio here. Just tell me. Maybe we'll end up on this question. As you toured with the book, I'm sure you are meeting members of the Iranian diaspora, and of course, like a byproduct of the revolution is this flowering of the Iranian diaspora in North America and in Canada, US, and in elsewhere. And we talk a lot about the impact of the Iranian Revolution on sort of American policy, on geopolitics, but we don't talk enough about its impact on Iran as a nation and Iranian as a people. And I know that's a big, loaded question. And I'm just wondering, kind of, if you have gleaned any insights from your reporting about where such a major event as the Iranian, how has it changed the country? How has it changed the people? And where our things are today?
Yeah, it's a big question. But well, first of all, Iran is a really young country. So 85% of the population now has been born after the revolution 45 years ago. So they have no memory of the Shah. And so they've been raised in an environment where that past is vilified, of course. I'm still in touch with, I wasn't able to go to Iran they wouldn't let me into the country for this book, but I've stayed in kind of discreet touch with a number of people inside Iran. Most of them would consider themselves in opposition to the regime. There was a lot of hope 2-3 years ago with the women's movement, women's freedom movement. I've talked with people since, in June, after the American and Israeli bombings of Iran, and almost everybody I've talked to since then is just in a state of despondency because there's been this huge rallying around the flag effect to the regime. It turns out that people just don't like having their country bombed by a foreign power. Go figure.
Go figure.
And so now, if the opposition try to go out and protest, they're tarred as lackeys of the Americans and the Israelis. So they feel like they've really been kind of gutted by what the Americans and Israelis did. So you're at this weird. I feel like you're at this weird moment now with Iran, where as a regional power, it's been dramatically weakened. They've had their proxy allies, the Hezbollah, the Houthis, kind of taken out one by one. But internally, I think they might be stronger than ever. And the last thing I'll say about the regime in Iran, it's not North Korea. And a lot of Iranians kind of can come and go. And I think the regime has been very clever in knowing when to ease off the repression at times. They're actually quite responsive to that, so that people can say, well, okay, I don't like the regime, but things are better than they were 5 years ago. And then when things get too advanced with protest movements, they send in the Basiji, the guys, they're gunmen on motorcycles, to kill 2 or 3 demonstrators to terrify people. And so the combination of the two, I think, is again, clever in a negative sense of how you hold on to power.
Not knowing, yeah.